This passage that describes the straight and narrow, I think is looked on harshly by some because it seems to say that the number of those who are going to find heaven is relatively small by comparison. And the straight gate, and the wide gate, the narrow way, the straight way. I suspect that part of this reaction to this verse is why the Lord's church historically has been criticized for, well, you guys think you're the only ones going to heaven, because there's only going to be a few, and that must be you. What is interesting, though, I think, about this verse, or verses, is where it appears in the Sermon on the Mount. Because Jesus starts out the Sermon on the Mount talking about all kinds of things, and we're going to look at the very first part of the sermon today. But prior to this, Christ provides a lot of instruction to us about who we ought to be, and what we ought to be, and who our relationships ought to be like, and how we're supposed to conduct ourselves in our daily lives. During one of our first lessons back from COVID, I did a lesson on the Sermon on the Mount, which I'm planning to do again sometime in the not too distant future. So before arriving at this, Jesus is going to offer up what I don't think anybody would argue is the greatest sermon ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, for those of us who are charged with trying to present lessons, there are literally dozens of sermons in that one sermon. And so I believe that before giving this admonition about what Matthew 7 says, he's going to talk to us about life relationships. And Jesus understood that it was going to be important to discuss somebody's character. And that's why I want us to ask ourselves the question, not, are you happy? I want us to ask the question, are you really happy? It's different. You know, I think there are some people that say, yeah, I'm okay. That's not being really happy. And when we think about it, what is recorded at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, of Matthew chapter 5, he hits at, I think, a great discussion to help us answer the question, are you really genuinely happy? This area is what is called the Mount of Beatitudes. It is a site on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. It is between Capernaum and what we historically have called Gennesaret. That's exactly where the Mount of Beatitudes is found. And it is here where the lesson gets presented. The first portion of the Sermon on the Mount we refer to as the Beatitudes. And I like what I heard one time where it said, if you really think about it, these are the Beatitudes. This is what you should be. It's what's supposed to be in you as a Christian. And as I put this together again, it struck me that it could be in some ways described as the single most important Christian self-help lesson that's ever been presented. Self-help. Because if you really want to be what God wants you to be, Jesus sets forth both the nature and the aspirations of what citizens in His kingdom should look like, what they should possess. And they are learned characteristics and traits. All of these traits, I would suggest to you, are the marks, goals, of what a Christian should be. And it's not as though we can major in one of them and ignore the others. If we're going to be the kind of people in His kingdom that God wants us to be, we have to have all of these. And so that's why it's going to get really testy, I think, when you start going through them and think, well, you know, I'm okay with this one. I do pretty good with this one. That one over there I'm not so sure about. We're going to have all of these. And if you meet someone who claims to be a Christian and they don't possess these attributes, maybe you ought to question the nature of their salvation hope. Because as Jesus says right after this, by their fruits you'll know them. And so, you know, we can claim to be whatever we want to be, but if these things aren't evident in our life and they don't show up in the fruit that we're producing, we may have to go back and think some more about how well we've mastered these attributes and have we done so honestly. The first one, before we get to the discussion of the straight and narrow, is the word blessed. Now, the word blessed is the same, and in your translation, it may actually say happy. It's the Greek word makarios. And by the way, I wanted to do a little bit different angle on a discussion of the Beatitudes. I've heard lessons on the Beatitudes so many times. One thing I want to emphasize to you this morning is what the original language actually means. You know, because we can read it in English and we can think about it, but when we start really digging down a little bit and find out what that Beatitude actually says, it may strike us at a completely different level. This word, blessed, describes, according to Barclay and Barclay's commentary, a joy which has its secret within itself. A joy that has a secret within itself. It is serene, untouchable, and self-contained. It is a joy which is completely independent of all of, get this, completely independent of all of the chances and all of the changes of life. Joy isn't affected by what happens to you in life. You can be blessed, you can have joy, and all that other stuff we have to learn how to deal with. All right, so here's where we start. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The first thing he's going to tell us is that happiness is all about being humble. It's all about humility. Because we're talking here about those who are described as the poor in spirit. Now, in our effort to understand the language, the poor in spirit here, according to the definition of the original Greek, means they have no spiritual assets. Eddie got up and talked about our assets this morning. And we're doing really good. We're doing very well. Yeah, we're only behind 6,000. We got 143 to cover. We got plenty of assets. When you're poor in spirit, you're bankrupt of spiritual assets. They know that they are spiritually bankrupt, and according to the ancient Greek, they had a word here, makarios, which carries with it two connotations. One is that the poor in spirit are one, the working poor, and the other one, which is the way it is used here, is these are the truly poor. You ever know some people that were poor and some that were truly poor? It's a difference, isn't it? Those who are poor in spirit are such that in order to get the spiritual assets that they know they need, they have to beg for them. We have a lot of people around who stand on corners with signs and boxes. And sometimes I will give them something, and sometimes there's something that keeps me from doing it. He says that if you're poor in spirit, you got to get your beggar box out. Because you got to find some spiritual assets, because you understand in your poverty of spirit that it is an absolute prerequisite in order for you to go to heaven. You have to understand how much you need. And that if we somehow, for some reason, harbor the illusion that we can create our own spiritual assets, we lose. It is when we recognize that we are completely and totally dependent upon God to give us everything we need, and that He did in starting with the giving of His Son, the very best He had, that's the beginning of structuring the assets that are going to be part of our spiritual side. So to be happy, we have to be poor in spirit. He then goes on to say, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. In the original Greek language here, the notion that we have for the word mourn means that they are, the grammar indicates they are intense in their mourning. You ever been to a funeral where there were people who were intense in their mourning? And have you ever been to a funeral where you worry a little bit that they don't seem to be mourning? people deal with this differently. Jesus didn't speak about some kind of casual sorrow here that comes as a result of the consequences of our sin. He's talking about a deep grief before God over our fallen state, that we know that we are outside of the love of God, that we are outside of the hope of grace. Blessed are those who truly mourn. Why? They're going to be comforted. And happiness is going to come from that mourning. Those who mourn over their sins, who recognize what this sinful condition looks like, Jesus promised them comfort. Now, God doesn't allow grief into our lives as a path. It's not a destination. Those who mourn have an opportunity to get to know something special about God. When we weep, when we are saddened, when we are grieved by the low condition that we have both as individuals and as a society, then we start to mourn over the effects of what's happening. While we shouldn't, I think, worry, I do think that it should grieve us that we see how many people disappoint God, and if we do that in our own lives. And it's interesting that when Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 2, that the mourning is this mourning over the sin and its effects, that this mourning is godly sorrow. And what did Paul say? That godly sorrow produces repentance. We need to mourn because it's going to be good for us. It's going to change us. It's going to set us back in the right path. Blessed are we when we mourn, because comfort will come as a result of God's grace for our sin. Next he says, depending on your translation, blessed are the gentle, yours may say meek, for they shall inherit the earth. It is impossible to translate the Greek word praus, which is used here for meek. It's impossible to translate it into English only using one term. It is so multifaceted in concept. It is the idea of a proper balance between anger and indifference. That you have a powerful personality, but it is under control. And it is based in humility. And that our happiness, blessedness, comes from our ability to have self-control over the lives that we live and the circumstances that we come in contact with. Ellie Grace, this is for you. When we see that verse, and we look at the ancient language, the meek person was not somebody who was passive or easily pushed around. The main idea behind this is strength under control. When I see little kids on a big horse, it always makes me smile and makes me nervous. Because I've been on a big horse, and it didn't go well. And what he's saying here is that when we have this kind of level of meekness, it doesn't make any difference what power exists. We have it under control. And in a case like this, I dare say that whoever brought that young child into the world would not have allowed them to be up there, except that they thought that that horse was under control. You and I, we can only be meek when we are willing to control our desire, our rights, our privileges, because we understand that God has the ability, and He will comfort us, and we will be confident that He will keep us in His care. God will not allow His meek ones to come up on the short end of the deal. And that's why He said, blessed are the meek. Why? Because they are going to inherit the earth. He's going to see to it. And that's what we should do. Next He says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. This describes a different kind of hunger, though. What is originally in the language here is a notion of a profound hunger that cannot be satisfied easily. You know, so when we're leaving the house to come to church, Lisa says, go get me an oatmeal cake. That's just a snack. That's not a meal. And what he's saying here is that this hungering is intense. It is a passion that is real. It's natural. Like hunger and thirst are natural in a healthy person. The passion is intense, like hunger and thirst is. It can be painful, like hunger and thirst can be when it gets to a point. It is to be a driving force, just like hunger and thirst does when we really have to have something. It can be a sign of health that we are hungering and thirsty because it shows our desire to maintain health. Now, I understood when we got here this morning that I stand between you and lunch. But I think the question in this context is this: how does your hunger and thirst for righteousness manifest itself? How does it express itself? A person should long to have a righteous nature. A person who wants to be sanctified, who wants to be as close to God as God would have them to be made more holy, if you will. There are words that we find in Scripture that we don't like to talk about relative to ourselves. Like saved, forgiven, perfect, holy. Except that that's what hungering and thirsting after righteousness does. It provides all of that for us. And what we should be doing is longing to continue in God's righteousness. A man longs to see righteousness promoted in the world. That's what we want. That's what we should see. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, because they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, because they will receive mercy. This beatitude speaks not about those who will be merciful. This beatitude talks about those who are merciful. Those who have emptied out their pride. They have brought themselves to a poverty of spirit. They have brought themselves to mourning over their spiritual condition. It's mercy to receive the grace of meekness and to become gentle. It's mercy that understands why we want to be hungering and thirsting after righteousness. So this one is expected to show mercy because they've already received mercy. Is that you? Do we understand how much we have been forgiven? Do we understand how much we need the grace of God? And does that translate to others? You know, when we look at that story of the Good Samaritan, and you know the story, how that several passed by and they were supposed to be more holy and righteous, and the Samaritan comes along and takes care of his needs. You know, the merciful is the one who's going to show mercy to the ones who are weaker and poorer. And for those who weep and mourn, mercy will be shown to them. They're the ones who really want to try to fix broken relationships. It's the one who desires to have a good relationship with other people, and they choose to think the best of other people from the beginning. A belief that I have had most of my life, and I'm somewhat successful with it, is that everybody deserves the benefit of the doubt from the beginning. We don't know them. We don't know what they've gone through. We don't know what their background is. We don't know what their challenges in their life are. I don't care about their poverty. I don't care about their skin color. I don't care about their nation of origin. Everybody deserves a benefit of the doubt, because that's what Christians are supposed to do. If the Samaritan had decided that the person laying in the road was not from the right country, he'd have walked on by. And what did he say? They shall obtain mercy. If you want mercy from others, especially from God, then we need to take heed to be merciful to others. Some wonder why in the story of David and Saul, why it seems that David showed such incredible grace and mercy to Saul. David, who had done so many awful things in his own life. And I think one reason why God gave such mercy was because David was noticeably merciful to Saul. That's why he forgave David as much as he did. On several occasions, when he was unworthy of mercy, David was merciful to Saul. And for those who are merciful, they may obtain mercy. Then we find out, blessed are the pure in heart, because they're going to see God. In the ancient Greek language here, the phrase pure of heart carries with it this idea. Think about this. The pure of heart. Straightness, honesty, and clarity. The pure of heart, straightness, honesty, and clarity. There's two possible ideas here. One is that there is an inner moral purity. And that is in opposition to what some thought was important relative to an outward appearance of purity or ceremonial purity. The other idea is that they have a single undivided heart. That they are utterly, genuinely, totally, completely sincere in their devotion and commitment to God. And that giving themselves to God is why they could be happy. In Luke chapter 21 is the story of the widow's mite. And Jesus saw her putting a small amount into the treasury, and he said that out of her poverty she's given all that she has. God not only sees what you do, God knows why you did it. It's an important distinction. You see, you can do something a lot of people can see. God knows why. Gets at the heart. Separates the real intention from deed and motive. And when we think about this, and we see that in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 8, the scribes and the Pharisees had accused the disciples of eating bread without washing their hands. Grant, you and me, and who else is guilty? In Matthew 15:8, he said to them, why do you transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? God commanded, saying, honor your father and mother, and he who curses father and mother, let him be put to death. It's not about doing for the sake of being seen. It's about doing out of sincerity and honesty and love of heart. And that's what he's trying to tell us here. J.B. Phillips said, blessed are the utterly sincere. I like that. If we are totally committed to God, then the most wonderful reward. He said here, if you're going to be blessed here, blessed are the pure in heart. What? They shall see God. You say, but no man has seen God. Well, is this wrong? You see, I believe that what he is saying here is that this is a reward that we should not take for granted. That we will enjoy greater intimacy with God than we have ever imagined if we are totally committed to him. And that those sins in life and in our society that pollute things, like covetousness, oppression, lust, gossip, those are all things that blind a person. But when we have tried to give ourselves totally to God, we have a pure heart that is free from those pollutions. Blessed are they, because they will see God. Blessed are they that they will be peacemakers, shall be called the sons of God. This does not describe those who live in peace. This describes those who actually try to make peace. A peacemaker who try to overcome evil with good. The only way to accomplish this truly is by sharing the gospel of peace. God entrusted us, remember the phrase, with the ministry of reconciliation, 2 Corinthians 5. In evangelism, we're supposed to share the gospel because that is what brings peace to other people as we restore them back to God. That is the ministry of being reconciled. And yet we know that peacemakers who will be called the sons of God, the reward of peacemakers is often that they should be recognized as true children of God, but it doesn't seem to happen very often. And instead, we know that there are many who would rather build a wall than take one down, building walls between people. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. But I want to ask a hard question. Never met a man I didn't like. True or false? I have. Have you? And so, how does that fly in the face of the notion of being peacemakers? Well, the question is, what are we going to do about people that we really don't like very much? Well, he says that what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to become a peacemaker. And in Romans chapter 12 and verse 18, it's possible, for as much as possible depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Romans 14:19, let us pursue the things which make for peace, that they can edify one another. Paul says, look, it's easy to cause trouble. It's easy to make hardship. It's easier to build walls. He said, as Christians, do those things that make for peace. And yet we know sometimes that means that we have to give up what we want. That sometimes we have to give the benefit of the doubt. That sometimes we have to work harder to find good in people that we would describe as good for nothings. That's why we have humility. And it's always important for us to remember the whole world doesn't revolve around us. There's always going to be differences of opinion. There's always going to be controversy. There's always going to be some stronger brothers and weaker brothers. And we should never be ashamed of the truth. And yet, we should not use it as a hammer. It is to be a guide of love from God. And we must always treat other people with respect. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for my name's sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Not for, they're being persecuted not for themselves, not because of their own fanaticism, not because of their outrageousness in trying to present the compassion and love of God. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about people who are persecuted because of their love and their service to God. Whoa. It may not work anymore. It did. I've never had that happen before. I don't know what I was saying. So moving on. There will always be. It goofed up, didn't it? These two Beatitudes, by the way. Notice verse 10, verse 11. Jesus decided to add on an eighth one. And they are companion Beatitudes. Blessed are you when men revile you, persecute you, say all kind of evil falsely for an account of me. The character traits of the Beatitudes are things that really aren't valued in our society, not in our culture. We don't recognize, we don't give awards for the most pure in heart or for the most poor in spirit. And probably because our culture doesn't think too much about those. Really not important for most people. And so the king added this eighth one. It's almost like he's doubling down on the same concept. For those who are loyal and endure suffering, happiness is suffering for what's right. Some of you will recognize this guy. Tim Tebow. Played for the University of Florida, won a couple national championships, went on to play for Denver, and later, I think, for the Jets. And during his college career, he used to put these black things under his eyes, and on those things he would often write John 3:16. And then we would see him on the sidelines, bowed in prayer, and that sort of thing. Later he gained a lot of attention because he went on camera and pledged to remain sexually abstinent until marriage. In a 2010 Super Bowl commercial that featured himself and his mother, Pam, he referred to his parents as the missionary parents. They made the courageous decision to give birth at a time when the physicians told them not to, that it was too dangerous. Yet the world persecutes people who stand for what they believe. Remember, it's more than what we believe. It's what God says. That's what makes the distinction. You know, we can take what God says and we can twist it and fix it how we'd like for it to be. That's not what we're supposed to do. The characteristics that are expressed in these Beatitudes are so opposite to the manner of the thinking of most people in our society that our persecution can't be compared to others. But the truth is, if nobody speaks evil of you, how prevalent, how obvious are the Beatitudes in your life? Blessed are you when men will revile you and persecute you. Why? For the sake of righteousness. It's a true challenge. How can suffering bring happiness? All kinds of ways. You know, it can realize the strength that Christ gives. It can help us get our priorities in order and provide patience and hope. And it helps us to forgive the faults that we see in other people. It makes us thankful for people who are being assistant to us. Those people who truly care. God blesses marital partners when they are trying to help each other get to heaven. The single most important thing in marriage. If you're happy, that's great. If you're going to heaven, that's wonderful. And what we need to do is realize how great heaven will be. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great, he said in Matthew 5. Rejoice and be glad. One last phrase. The phrase rejoice and be glad here in the original Greek could be translated into English, leap for joy. And we have a whole bunch, I decided one time, we have a whole bunch of historical examples of people who were martyred, who went dancing to their martyring. Jumping for joy, they get to burn at the stake. Rejoice and be glad, because your reward is out there. They persecuted the prophets. They're going to persecute you. The great reward in heaven will be with those in great company, because this is what leads to heaven. Jesus said, I will never forsake you. We can confidently say that the Lord is my helper. I will not fear what man can do to me. This is the way that leads to heaven, and that is the trust that we must put in God. For those of you who are here this morning, you know what you need to do. We've been over this many, many times. We're going to sing this song as a means of encouragement for you.